Newcomb's Paradox. Newcomb's paradox is a famous and deeply puzzling thought experiment in decision theory and philosophy that raises profound questions about free will, prediction, and rational choice. At its core, the paradox sets up a situation in which two seemingly reasonable principles, expected utility maximization and dominance reasoning, appear to contradict each other, creating a tension that has sparked debate among philosophers, economists, and logicians for decades. The setup is as follows: you are presented with two boxes, labeled Box A and Box B. The rules of the game are explained to you in advance by a highly reliable entity, a superintelligent predictor, whose predictions about human behavior have been correct in virtually every past case. The contents of the boxes are arranged in this way. Box A contains $1,000, and is always filled. Box B contains either $1 million or nothing, depending on what the predictor thinks you will do. Here's the key. If the predictor predicts that you will take both boxes, it puts nothing in Box B. If the predictor predicts that you will take only Box B, it puts $1 million in it. You are given a simple choice: take only Box B, or take both Box A and Box B. You already know what's in Box A, $1,000, but you don't know whether Box B contains the $1 million or is empty. The predictor has already made its decision and filled the boxes before you choose. The paradox emerges when we try to decide what the rational choice is. On one hand, you might reason as follows: the predictor has already filled the boxes. That decision is in the past. Whatever is in Box B is fixed now, regardless of what I choose. So why not take both boxes? If Box B contains $1 million, I'll get $1,001,000. If it's empty, I still walk away with $1,000. Taking both boxes dominates taking only one. This reasoning is called dominance reasoning, choosing the option that gives you a better outcome in every possible scenario. But on the other hand, you might reason differently: the predictor is almost always right. If I choose only Box B, it likely predicted that, and I'll get $1 million. If I choose both boxes, the predictor probably saw that coming, and Box B will be empty. So the best way to actually get $1 million is to take only Box B. This is expected utility reasoning, choosing the option that, based on past outcomes and probabilities, has the best expected payoff. So which choice is correct? The paradox lies in the fact that each line of reasoning appears entirely logical, yet they lead to opposite choices. Those who favor taking both boxes are known as two-boxers, relying on the logic of dominance. Those who favor taking only Box B are called one-boxers, relying on expected utility and the remarkable accuracy of the predictor. Philosophers have tried to resolve this paradox in various ways. Some argue that the paradox reveals a flaw in our assumptions about causality and prediction. Others suggest that it challenges the distinction between determinism and free will. If the predictor is always right, do we really have freedom of choice at all? Still others invoke causal decision theory versus evidential decision theory. Causal decision theorists tend to two-box, arguing that your action cannot causally affect what is already in the box. Evidential decision theorists tend to one-box, arguing that your choice is strong evidence of what's in the box because of the predictor's near-perfect record. Newcomb's paradox doesn't offer a simple resolution. Instead, it exposes a deep rift in our understanding of rationality, prediction, and the nature of decision-making. It remains one of the most thought-provoking puzzles in modern philosophy, precisely because both sides of the argument can be defended so compellingly, and because it forces us to question what it really means to choose rationally in a world where our choices might somehow be foreseen. The Monty Hall Paradox. The Monty Hall Paradox is a counterintuitive probability puzzle that arises from a game show scenario, most famously associated with the American television show Let's Make a Deal and its host, Monty Hall. On the surface, the problem seems to involve a straightforward choice, but it leads to a surprising and often misunderstood result that challenges our natural instincts about probability and decision-making. Imagine you are a contestant on a game show. You are presented with 3 closed doors. Behind one door is a car, the grand prize, and behind the other 2 are goats. You do not know what lies behind any of the doors. The host, Monty Hall, invites you to choose one of the 3 doors. Suppose you choose door 1. At this point, Monty, who knows what is behind each door, opens one of the 2 doors you didn't choose, revealing a goat. He then gives you a choice: stick with your original selection, door 1, or switch to the remaining unopened door, say, door 3. The question is, should you switch, stay, or does it make no difference? Most people intuitively think that once one losing door is revealed, there are 2 doors left, so the odds are now 50-50. They reason that it doesn't matter whether they switch or stay. But this intuition is misleading. In fact, you should always switch, because doing so doubles your chances of winning the car. Here's why: when you initially choose one of the 3 doors, the chance that you have picked the car is 1 in 3, or about 33%. The chance that the car is behind one of the other 2 doors is 2 in 3, or about 66%. This probability doesn't change after Monty reveals a goat, because his action of revealing a goat is not random. He will always reveal a goat, and never the car. When Monty opens a door to show a goat, he is effectively giving you information. He's confirming that the car is not behind the revealed door. That 2/3 probability, of the car being behind the 2 doors you didn't pick, gets concentrated onto the one remaining unopened door, because the other has been shown to be a goat. So, the door you didn't choose initially but is still closed now has a 2/3 chance of hiding the car, while your original pick still only has a 1/3 chance. In other words, switching doors gives you a 2/3 chance of winning the car, whereas sticking with your first choice gives you only a 1/3 chance. This result feels paradoxical because it defies our basic sense of fairness and symmetry. After one losing option is eliminated, it feels like the situation has reset to a simple 50-50 choice. But the crucial detail is that Monty's knowledge and actions are not random. They are carefully designed to maintain the original probabilities. The Monty Hall paradox illustrates how our intuition about probability, especially when it comes to conditional events and additional information, can lead us astray. It has been the subject of heated debate and widespread misunderstanding, even among mathematicians and statisticians. Yet, when analyzed carefully using basic principles of probability theory, the solution becomes clear: you should always switch. This paradox serves as a powerful example of how human intuition often struggles with probability, and why formal reasoning is sometimes necessary to arrive at the correct answer. It also highlights the importance of understanding how new information affects probabilities, especially when that information comes from an informed source like Monty Hall, who is not acting randomly but deliberately. The twin paradox. The twin paradox is one of the most famous and fascinating thought experiments in modern physics, particularly in the theory of special relativity, developed by Albert Einstein. Despite its name, it is not a true logical paradox in the sense of being a contradiction, but rather a counterintuitive scenario that challenges our everyday understanding of time, motion, and simultaneity. The resolution lies not in finding a flaw in relativity, but in understanding the subtle way time behaves in different frames of reference. The scenario typically goes like this: imagine 2 identical twins on Earth. One twin remains on Earth, the stay-at-home twin, while the other twin boards a spaceship and travels at a speed close to the speed of light to a distant star, then turns around and comes back. According to the principles of special relativity, the traveling twin will experience time dilation, that is, time will pass more slowly for them relative to the twin who remains on Earth. From the perspective of the stay-at-home twin, the traveler's clock ticks more slowly during the entire journey. So when the traveling twin returns to Earth, they will have aged less than their sibling. For example, if the trip takes 10 years according to the Earth twin, the traveling twin may have experienced only 6 years due to the effects of high-speed motion. This result has been experimentally confirmed with precise atomic clocks flown on airplanes or placed on satellites, where clocks moving at high speeds tick slightly slower than those on the ground. Here's where the apparent paradox arises: relativity is symmetric. That is, in the framework of special relativity, there is no absolute motion, only motion relative to something else. So, couldn't the traveling twin say that they were at rest and that the Earth twin was the one moving away and then coming back? If so, wouldn't the Earth twin be the one who aged less? How can both twins see the other as aging more slowly? This question seems to suggest a contradiction in the logic of special relativity. But the key to resolving the paradox lies in recognizing that the situation is not truly symmetric. The two twins do not undergo the same experiences. The twin who travels to the stars and back undergoes acceleration and deceleration, changing frames of reference, especially when turning around at the midpoint of the journey. In contrast, the Earth-bound twin remains in a single inertial frame for the entire duration. Special relativity applies most directly to inertial frames, those that are not accelerating. The moment the traveling twin turns around to return to Earth, they shift from one inertial frame to another, breaking the symmetry. This acceleration introduces what can be thought of as a global time shift in how simultaneity is defined in relativity. During the turnaround, the traveling twin must recalculate which Earth events are simultaneous with their current position, and this jump in simultaneity results in a leap forward in the Earth twin's age from the traveler's point of view. So, while each twin sees the other's clock ticking slowly during the portions of the journey when they are moving at constant speed, the traveling twin's acceleration makes their experience of time fundamentally different from that of the stationary twin. As a result, the asymmetry leads to a consistent and non-contradictory outcome: the traveling twin is younger upon return. The twin paradox highlights the non-intuitive nature of time in Einstein's relativistic universe. It forces us to rethink basic notions such as simultaneity, duration, and motion. It shows that time is not an absolute backdrop flowing at the same rate for everyone, but a dimension intertwined with space, affected by velocity and gravity. Far from being a flaw in the theory, the twin paradox is actually a striking demonstration of relativity's predictive power, and it has been borne out in countless experiments. What makes it so intriguing is how it confronts our deeply ingrained expectations about the passage of time and shows that the universe behaves in ways that often defy common sense, but not logic or physics. The paradox of the unexpected hanging. The paradox of the unexpected hanging is a thought-provoking and puzzling logical paradox that arises from the interaction between knowledge, prediction, and surprise. It typically unfolds in a scenario where a judge tells a condemned prisoner that he will be hanged at noon on one weekday in the coming week, but the execution will be a surprise. The prisoner will not know the day of the hanging until the executioner arrives at his cell at noon on that very day. At first, this may seem straightforward, a grim surprise awaiting the prisoner sometime soon. But when the prisoner begins to reason through the implications of the judge's statement, a logical paradox emerges. The prisoner considers the nature of the surprise. He reasons that he cannot be hanged on Friday. If he were still alive by Thursday night, and had not yet been hanged, then Friday would be the only remaining possible day. In that case, the hanging would not be a surprise, because he would be able to logically deduce that it must occur on Friday. But the judge said it would be a surprise. Therefore, the prisoner concludes, he cannot be hanged on Friday. Having eliminated Friday, he turns to Thursday. If he is still alive by Wednesday night and knows he cannot be hanged on Friday, then Thursday becomes the last possible day for the hanging. But again, this would make the hanging predictable on Thursday, and thus not a surprise. Therefore, Thursday must also be ruled out. Following this logic, he continues to eliminate Wednesday, then Tuesday, and finally Monday, using the same reasoning at each step. Ultimately, he convinces himself that a surprise hanging cannot occur on any day of the week. He concludes that the judge's statement must have been false or logically impossible. However, when the executioner arrives at his cell at noon on, say, Wednesday, the prisoner is caught completely off guard, he is surprised. Despite all his reasoning, the hanging does take place, and it is unexpected, just as the judge said it would be. This outcome seems to contradict the prisoner's logical deduction, leading to the paradox. The heart of the paradox lies in the prisoner's assumption that he can use logic to eliminate each possibility in advance, thereby preventing the possibility of surprise. But the actual surprise reveals a gap in his reasoning, namely, that the very act of overanalyzing and assuming perfect foresight undermines the nature of surprise itself. The paradox exposes a tension between logical deduction and the unpredictable nature of knowledge and expectations. Philosophers, logicians, and mathematicians have debated the implications of the unexpected hanging paradox for decades. Some argue that it highlights the limits of self-referential reasoning, much like the liar paradox or Epimenides statement. Others suggest it illustrates how certain kinds of statements, particularly those involving prediction, belief, and self-reference, resist formal logical analysis. In practical terms, it also touches on deeper questions about the nature of time, expectation, and what it means to know something in advance. Ultimately, the paradox remains unresolved in the strictest logical sense. It continues to serve as a rich and perplexing example of how language, logic, and human reasoning can produce contradictions that are not easily untangled. The Infinite Library Paradox. The Infinite Library Paradox is a philosophical and conceptual puzzle that arises from imagining a library that contains every possible book that can ever be written using a finite alphabet and a fixed set of rules. The most famous formulation of this idea comes from Jorge Luis Borges in his short story The Library of Babel, where he describes a vast, seemingly endless library composed of books containing every possible combination of letters, spaces, and punctuation marks. At first, this seems like a marvel of total knowledge, but upon closer reflection, it becomes a source of deep paradox and existential confusion. In the imagined library, every book is the same length, say 410 pages of 40 lines per page, with 80 characters per line. Using a set alphabet, for example, 25 symbols including the space, this produces a finite number of possible combinations for a book, but the number is so vast it is effectively infinite for all practical purposes. Therefore, the library contains every book that has ever been written or could ever be written, including all true histories, all false histories, every version of your life story, every scientific discovery, and every possible misstatement of every scientific discovery. It contains Shakespeare's plays, word for word, but also an infinite number of versions where just one word is changed, or the letters are scrambled into meaningless gibberish. At the heart of the paradox is this unsettling realization: if a library contains everything, then it also contains nothing of use. Any book of truth is buried among infinite volumes of nonsense. Even if a book appears to be meaningful, there is no way to verify that it is accurate without already possessing the knowledge it claims to reveal. The presence of all possible truths does not help if we have no way to distinguish truth from falsehood. This leads to a kind of epistemic despair. The more comprehensive the library becomes, the more impossible it is to find anything of value. Information and misinformation become indistinguishable, and meaning itself becomes lost in the sheer scale of possibilities. A paradox emerges, not from logical contradiction, but from a collapse in the utility of knowledge. A system that contains all truths is no better than one that contains none if it cannot be navigated. The infinite library paradox also highlights a problem in the philosophy of language and information theory, the distinction between syntax, symbols arranged in a rule-governed way, and semantics, meaning. The library contains every syntactically possible book, but most of them are semantically meaningless. The paradox illustrates that meaning does not arise merely from the arrangement of letters, but from context, interpretation, and an external system of value that the library itself does not provide. In modern terms, the paradox resonates with challenges in artificial intelligence, big data, and the Internet. The digital world is increasingly an infinite library of sorts. For every piece of useful knowledge, there are countless false or irrelevant pieces. Search engines, algorithms, and curators act as modern librarians, trying to impose order on a chaos of content. Yet even with such tools, the paradox remains at a conceptual level. Having access to everything does not equate to understanding anything. The infinite library paradox, then, is not a paradox in the traditional logical sense but a profound conceptual problem. It forces us to confront the limits of knowledge, the nature of meaning, and the price of total informational completeness. It asks, if every answer is already written somewhere, but hidden in an endless sea of symbols, how do we know anything at all? And perhaps more hauntingly, how do we know that what we found is the truth and not just a mirage that happened to resemble it? In this way, the paradox becomes a reflection not only on language and logic, but on the human condition itself, our desire for certainty in a universe that may contain all possible meanings, and yet offer no clear guide to which meaning is real. The Paradox of Freedom. The paradox of freedom is a philosophical dilemma that arises when we consider the consequences of unlimited or absolute freedom in a society. At first glance, freedom seems like an unequivocally good ideal, one that allows individuals to think, act, speak, and live according to their own will. But the paradox emerges when we recognize that if everyone is completely free to do whatever they want, that freedom can, in practice, destroy itself. The idea can be framed like this: if people are entirely free, then some will inevitably choose to use that freedom to dominate, exploit, or oppress others. In a system of total freedom, nothing inherently prevents a powerful individual or group from suppressing the freedoms of others through coercion, violence, or manipulation. In this way, absolute freedom can lead to its opposite, tyranny or anarchy where only the strongest prevail. This paradox has been explored by numerous thinkers throughout history, including Karl Popper, who formulated a related idea known as the paradox of tolerance. But in the context of freedom, the core concern is this: a society that guarantees unrestricted liberty to all may end up allowing certain forces to erode that liberty from within. For example, consider freedom of speech. If this freedom is extended without any limitations, it might include the freedom to incite violence, spread misinformation, or promote ideologies that aim to eliminate the very freedom that allows them to be expressed. If a society tolerates such uses of freedom without boundaries, it may unwittingly pave the way for authoritarianism or social collapse. This leads to a philosophical and political tension. To preserve a just and free society, some freedoms may need to be curtailed, not to suppress liberty, but to protect it. Laws, norms, and institutions often place limits on individual behavior to prevent harm, protect rights, and ensure fairness. These restrictions can seem like violations of freedom, but paradoxically, they are necessary to uphold a broader, more sustainable version of it. The paradox is not about denying freedom but about recognizing that freedom without structure or limits becomes unstable. If freedom becomes license, if there is no distinction between liberty and lawlessness, then the very conditions that make freedom possible are undermined. A society where anyone can do anything at any time is not truly free, it is chaotic and dangerous. In modern terms, this paradox shows up in debates about civil liberties, government regulation, free markets, and social responsibility. How much freedom should individuals have? When do restrictions become oppression, and when are they necessary protections? Where should the line be drawn between freedom from interference and freedom within a just order? Ultimately, the paradox of freedom teaches us that freedom must be balanced with responsibility, and that sustaining liberty requires more than simply removing all constraints. It requires thoughtful boundaries, moral norms, and collective safeguards that ensure freedom does not become a tool for its own destruction. In this sense, true freedom is not the absence of all rules, but the presence of the right ones. The Omnipotence Paradox. The Omnipotence Paradox is a classic and enduring philosophical puzzle that challenges the coherence of the concept of an all-powerful being, most often in the context of monotheistic theology, where God is traditionally described as omnipotent. The paradox emerges when we try to analyze what it really means to be all-powerful, and whether such power can be exercised in logically contradictory or self-defeating ways. The most famous version of the paradox is posed as a question: can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy that it cannot lift it? This question seems simple, but it leads to a dilemma. If the being can create such a stone, then there is at least one thing it cannot do: lift the stone, and thus it is not truly omnipotent. On the other hand, if it cannot create the stone, then again, there is something it cannot do: create an unliftable stone, and so it is not omnipotent in that case either. Either way, the being appears to lack some power, which contradicts the definition of omnipotence. This paradox is not limited to just stones. It generalizes to any task that involves self-limitation or logical contradiction. Can an omnipotent being destroy itself? Can it make 2 + 2 = 5? Can it create a square circle or a married bachelor? Each of these asks whether unlimited power includes the power to do what is logically impossible or self-defeating. One proposed resolution to the paradox comes from distinguishing between logical possibility and physical or causal possibility. Some philosophers argue that omnipotence should be understood as the power to do all things that are logically possible, not logically incoherent ones. Under this view, tasks like creating a stone too heavy to lift, or a square circle, are not genuine tasks at all. They are nonsensical combinations of words that do not describe possible realities. Therefore, failing to perform them does not count as a limitation of power, just as failing to draw a four-sided triangle does not reflect a failure of artistic skill. Another approach is to refine the definition of omnipotence. Instead of defining it as the ability to do absolutely anything, some theologians and philosophers define it as the ability to do anything that is consistent with the nature of the being in question. For instance, an omnipotent and rational being would not perform contradictions, because doing so would violate its rational nature. This idea allows us to preserve the concept of omnipotence without requiring it to encompass contradictions. Yet others see the paradox as a challenge to the very coherence of omnipotence as a concept. They argue that if the definition of omnipotence leads to contradictions, then it is not a meaningful or possible attribute. In this view, the paradox reveals a fundamental limitation in trying to describe any being, divine or otherwise, as truly all-powerful. The Omnipotence Paradox also invites deeper reflection on the relationship between power, logic, and the nature of God. Is logic something external to God, which even omnipotence cannot override? Or is logic itself part of the divine nature, inseparable from the divine will? This leads into profound metaphysical and theological debates about the structure of reality and the limits, if any, of divine action. In the end, the Omnipotence Paradox does not offer a final answer, but rather serves as a powerful tool for examining our assumptions about power, possibility, and the nature of the divine. It illustrates how even seemingly straightforward concepts can become deeply puzzling when subjected to rigorous philosophical scrutiny. The Paradox of Value. The paradox of value, also known as the diamond water paradox, is a classic problem in economics and philosophy that highlights the puzzling difference between an item's use value and its exchange value. It was famously discussed by thinkers such as Plato, Aristotle, John Locke, and most notably Adam Smith, the father of modern economics. The paradox arises when we compare the value of two goods that seem to have drastically different prices despite their apparent usefulness. Take water and diamonds. Water is absolutely essential for human survival, while diamonds are primarily decorative. Without water, life cannot exist. Yet, in a market economy, water is often very cheap, or even free in some places, while diamonds command extremely high prices. Why is something so crucial to life valued so little in monetary terms, while something non-essential is so expensive? This contradiction between necessity and price is the heart of the paradox. If value were based purely on usefulness or importance, then water should be worth far more than diamonds. But in practice, the opposite is often true. The resolution to the paradox lies in understanding marginal utility, a concept developed later by economists such as Carl Menger, William Stanley Jevons, and Leon Walras in the 19th century. Marginal utility refers to the additional satisfaction or benefit a person gets from consuming one more unit of a good. It's not the total usefulness of the good that determines its price, but rather how much people are willing to pay for an extra unit of it, given its availability and their needs. Water, while essential, is usually abundant in most environments. Because it is easy to access, the marginal utility of an extra cup of water is relatively low. People already have enough to drink, wash, and cook. Diamonds, on the other hand, are scarce and difficult to extract. Their marginal utility remains high because they are rare, desired for their aesthetic and symbolic value, and not readily available. People are willing to pay a premium for that rarity, not because diamonds are useful in a survival sense, but because their scarcity and social meaning give them high exchange value. Thus, the paradox of value dissolves once we separate total utility from marginal utility. Water has high total utility but low marginal utility, leading to low prices in most contexts. Diamonds have low total utility but high marginal utility, leading to high prices. The market reflects not the absolute importance of a good, but its relative scarcity and the subjective valuation placed on each additional unit. This paradox remains a foundational concept in economics, teaching us that value is not an objective property of things but a dynamic result of human needs, preferences, and available supply. It highlights how price, usefulness, and scarcity interact in complex ways that can defy our initial intuition but make perfect sense under deeper analysis. The Agreement Paradox. The Agreement Paradox is a philosophical and logical puzzle that arises in situations where two rational agents, each fully informed of the other's beliefs and reasoning capabilities, find themselves in disagreement. At first glance, this seems unremarkable. People disagree all the time. But when framed under idealized conditions of perfect rationality and shared information, such disagreements should not persist. Yet they often do, and this leads to a surprising and subtle paradox. The paradox is most famously captured in a result by economist and philosopher Robert Aumann in 1976, often referred to as Aumann's agreement theorem. It shows that if two agents are Bayesian rational, meaning they update their beliefs using Bayes' theorem, and if they have common knowledge of each other's beliefs, then they cannot agree to disagree. More precisely, If it is common knowledge between them that they hold different probabilities for some event, then their beliefs must, in fact, be the same. Common knowledge, in this context, means more than just mutual awareness. It means that both agents know each other's belief, both know that both know, and so on ad infinitum. Under such conditions, any difference in belief should lead to immediate updating until they converge on the same conclusion. But this theoretical prediction flies in the face of real-life experience. Even well-informed, rational individuals often maintain divergent views, even after lengthy discussion. This is the core of the agreement paradox. How can rational agents, who share all relevant information and understand each other's reasoning perfectly, end up in persistent disagreement? The paradox challenges our assumptions about rationality and belief formation. If Ullmann's theorem holds, then either 1. Disagreements between rational individuals under perfect conditions should not occur, or 2. Such conditions, perfect information, perfect reasoning, and true common knowledge, almost never exist in reality. Most philosophers and economists accept the second conclusion. The conditions required by the theorem are extraordinarily rare or even impossible to achieve in practice. In most real-world interactions, people lack common knowledge, interpret evidence differently, or are influenced by background assumptions that are not fully shared. Yet the paradox still serves as a powerful idealized standard. It suggests that, at least in principle, persistent disagreement between rational agents indicates some breakdown in information sharing, trust, or reasoning. If two people genuinely believe that the other is rational and informed, then learning that the other believes something different should be a reason to reevaluate one's own belief. The very existence of the disagreement is, in theory, evidence that at least one person may be wrong. Some have tried to resolve the paradox by pointing out that in real life, we rarely treat others as perfectly rational, or we discount their reasoning due to perceived biases, differing priors, or social incentives. In that case, disagreement does not violate rationality, it reflects rational agents adjusting for imperfect trust in others' epistemic processes. In other words, we can rationally disagree if we don't fully believe in each other's rationality or information quality. The agreement paradox also has practical implications for discourse, especially in politics, science, and ethics. It raises the question of what it really means to agree to disagree. If such a stance is adopted in a context where the parties do trust each other's intelligence and access to evidence, then continuing to disagree seems irrational. On the other hand, if disagreement persists, perhaps it reveals deeper epistemic divides, differences in assumptions, interpretations, or credibility assessments that go beyond surface-level reasoning. Ultimately, the agreement paradox reveals the tension between ideal models of rational belief and the messier reality of human disagreement. It doesn't simply ask whether people can disagree, it asks what disagreement means when we claim to value reason, evidence, and mutual understanding. It is not only a puzzle about logic, it is also a mirror reflecting the challenges of genuine communication and epistemic humility. The lottery ticket number paradox. The lottery ticket number paradox is a thought-provoking puzzle that lies at the intersection of probability, belief, and rational reasoning. It centers on how we treat highly improbable events and challenges our intuitions about what we should believe when faced with a large number of individually unlikely but collectively certain outcomes. The paradox is particularly relevant in discussions of epistemology, the study of knowledge and belief, and it reveals a tension between logical reasoning and our expectations about truth. Imagine a fair lottery with 1 million tickets, and suppose that exactly one ticket will win. Each ticket has an equal chance of winning, so the probability of any single ticket being the winner is 1 in 1 million, a very small number. Now suppose you are asked to consider the claim, ticket number 1 will not win. Given how low the chances are for any particular ticket, you might reasonably believe that this is true. In fact, you might apply the same logic to every individual ticket. Ticket number 2 will not win, ticket number 3 will not win, and so on, all the way to ticket #1000000. For each case, you are justified in believing that that particular ticket will probably not win. But now notice the problem: if you believe of each ticket that it will not win, then you are effectively believing that no ticket will win. Yet this directly contradicts your knowledge of how the lottery works. You know with certainty that one ticket must win. You are thus in the uncomfortable position of having a collection of beliefs, each individually reasonable, that together implies something you know to be false. This is the heart of the lottery ticket number paradox. It seems rational to believe that each individual ticket will lose, based on its low probability of winning, but it is irrational to believe that all tickets will lose, because one must win. The paradox reveals a conflict between probabilistic reasoning and logical consistency. Philosophers have used this paradox to explore the limits of rational belief, particularly in terms of how we handle high probability but not certain events. One possible lesson is that high probability alone does not justify belief. That is, we shouldn't believe a proposition merely because it's extremely likely to be true, especially if doing so leads us into contradiction when the same reasoning is applied repeatedly. Some responses to the paradox suggest that we must impose stricter rules on belief. For instance, one approach argues that belief should be reserved for propositions that are not only highly probable but also mutually consistent with other beliefs. Another approach suggests distinguishing between accepting a claim for practical purposes, like betting that a ticket will lose, and believing it in a strict epistemic sense. Others argue that the paradox shows we need to refine our understanding of collective reasoning. Just because it seems rational to make a certain judgment about each member of a group doesn't mean it is rational to apply that judgment to the group as a whole. In this view, the paradox reflects a kind of failure in aggregating individual judgments into a consistent set. The lottery ticket number paradox, while deceptively simple in structure, raises deep questions about how we deal with uncertainty, how we define rational belief, and how our intuitions about probability can mislead us. It serves as a reminder that rational thought involves more than just following the numbers. It requires careful attention to consistency, coherence, and the interplay between individual cases and collective outcomes. The Barber Paradox. The Barber Paradox is a self-referential logical puzzle that illustrates a fundamental problem in the concept of definition and set membership, particularly in the context of self-reference and contradictions. It was introduced by the British mathematician and logician Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century to demonstrate a problem in naive set theory, and is often presented in the form of a quaint village scenario. The paradox is framed as follows: in a village, there is a barber who is defined as the person who shaves all those, and only those, who do not shave themselves. The question then arises, does the barber shave himself? At first, the situation seems like a harmless riddle, but when we attempt to answer it, a contradiction quickly emerges. If the barber shaves himself, then according to the definition, he must not shave himself, because he only shaves those who do not shave themselves. But if he does not shave himself, then he fits into the category of those who are shaved by the barber, which means he must shave himself. In either case, we arrive at a contradiction: he shaves himself if and only if he does not shave himself. This creates an impossible and logically inconsistent situation. The underlying problem here is that the definition of the barber is self-referential and circular in a way that leads to inconsistency. The set of all people who do not shave themselves cannot consistently include the person who shaves all such people without running into logical trouble when that person is considered a member of the set. The contradiction exposes a limitation in the way sets or conditions can be defined when self-reference is involved. Russell introduced the Barber Paradox not as an actual problem about barbers, but as an illustration of a deeper issue in naive set theory. In naive set theory, it was assumed that any coherent condition could define a set. For example, one might try to define the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. The problem is, when you ask whether this set contains itself, you end up in a situation structurally identical to the Barber Paradox. If it does contain itself, then by definition it must not, and if it does not contain itself, then by definition it must. This contradiction demonstrated that naive set theory, which lacked restrictions on how sets could be formed, was inconsistent. To resolve this problem, Bertrand Russell developed what became known as Russell's theory of types, which introduced a hierarchy to avoid such self-referential definitions. In this theory, sets, or predicates, are organized into levels, where a set at one level can only contain elements from a lower level, not from the same or higher levels. This prevents a set from containing itself or being defined in terms of itself, thereby avoiding the kind of contradiction seen in the Barber Paradox. Thus, the Barber Paradox serves as a memorable and accessible metaphor for a much deeper logical and mathematical issue. Its deceptive simplicity highlights the dangers of unrestricted self-reference and the importance of carefully constructed logical frameworks. Although it may appear to be a whimsical thought experiment, the paradox underscores profound limitations in language, definition, and logic that continue to influence mathematics, computer science, and philosophy to this day. The Drinker Paradox. In a seemingly ordinary bar, consider the statement, "There is someone in this bar such that, if that person is drinking, then everyone in the bar is drinking." At first glance, this statement sounds suspicious or even false. How could the drinking behavior of one person dictate that of everyone else? It seems to suggest an unreasonable connection between individuals' actions, and yet, from a logical standpoint, the statement is undeniably true, regardless of how many people are in the bar or who is actually drinking. This is the essence of the Drinker Paradox, a result in classical logic that hinges on the structure of implication. In propositional logic, an implication is considered true if either the premise is false or the conclusion is true. So, the statement, "If P, then Q," is automatically true whenever P is false. This subtle yet powerful rule allows the Drinker Paradox to arise. Imagine two scenarios. In the first, no one in the bar is drinking. In that case, we can pick any individual, say, Alice, and say, if she is drinking, which she isn't, then everyone is drinking, which they aren't either. Since the premise is false, the implication is true. Thus, the statement holds. In the second scenario, suppose that at least one person is drinking. Choose that person, say, Bob. Then the statement, "If Bob is drinking, then everyone is drinking," depends on whether everyone else is also drinking. But if they are, then the implication is plainly true, because both the premise and the conclusion are true. If they're not, then Bob wasn't the right choice. But the paradox ensures that some person satisfies the condition, not necessarily the one we choose. In fact, the paradox doesn't assert that we can identify who this person is, only that one must exist. The key is that the logical structure ensures there must be at least one person for whom this implication holds, regardless of the overall drinking status in the bar. This result is a consequence of the rules of predicate logic and the way existential quantifiers interact with implication. It reveals how human intuition can sometimes be at odds with formal logic, especially when implication is involved. What seems counterintuitive at the surface becomes clearly valid when viewed through the precise lens of logical reasoning. Ultimately, the Drinker Paradox is not a contradiction but a demonstration of the power and oddity of formal logic, showing how conclusions can be both valid and surprising when stripped of everyday assumptions. The Liar Paradox. The liar paradox is a fascinating and enduring problem in logic and philosophy that emerges when a statement refers to itself in a way that leads to a contradiction. The most well-known and straightforward example of this paradox is the sentence, "This statement is false." At first glance, this seems like a simple declarative sentence, but upon closer inspection, it reveals a deep and perplexing logical inconsistency. To see the paradox in action, one must attempt to evaluate the truth value of the statement. If the statement, "This statement is false," is true, then what it asserts must hold, namely, that it is false. But if it is false, and yet we assumed it was true, we reach a contradiction. On the other hand, if the statement is false, then what it asserts is not the case, in other words, the statement is not false, which would mean it is true. This too leads to a contradiction. Thus, whether we assume the statement is true or false, we are driven into a logical loop where each possibility negates itself. It is not merely a case of not knowing whether the statement is true or false, rather, it is a case where assigning either truth value results in a contradiction. This is what gives the liar paradox its distinctive and troubling nature. Historically, the roots of this paradox can be traced back to the ancient Greeks. The philosopher Epimenides, himself a Cretan, famously declared that all Cretans are liars. If his statement is taken to be true, then as a Cretan, he is a liar, which would mean his statement is false. But if it is false, then not all Cretans are liars, in which case he could be telling the truth. This circularity, present in both the ancient and modern versions, reveals a fundamental challenge in self-referential statements, especially those that make claims about their own truth value. The liar paradox has significant implications beyond wordplay or philosophical amusement. It has influenced major developments in logic, mathematics, and the philosophy of language. In the 20th century, it played a crucial role in prompting inquiries into the foundations of mathematics and formal systems. The logician Kurt Gödel, for example, constructed his famous incompleteness theorems using a method of self-reference inspired by the logic of the liar paradox. His work demonstrated that any sufficiently powerful formal system cannot be both complete and consistent, and he used a form of self-referential sentence that effectively says, "This statement is not provable," which echoes the logical structure of the liar. Attempts to resolve or bypass the paradox have led to various philosophical and logical strategies. Some have proposed that language must be structured in hierarchical levels, so that statements cannot refer to their own truth within the same level of language. This was the approach taken by the logician Alfred Tarski, who suggested that a clear separation between object language, where statements are made, and metalanguage, where statements about statements are made, could prevent the kind of self-reference that produces the paradox. Others have proposed non-classical logics, such as paraconsistent logic, which allows for contradictions without rendering the entire logical system trivial. Another approach is dialetheism, the view that some contradictions can actually be true, that a statement can be both true and false at the same time. Though controversial, this position offers a radical way to accept and contain the paradox rather than eliminate it. Despite the variety of proposed resolutions, the liar paradox continues to challenge our understanding of truth, language, and logic. Its simple structure conceals a depth that continues to engage philosophers, logicians, and linguists alike. It highlights the complexities and potential limitations of formal systems and draws attention to the peculiarities of self-reference, making it not only a philosophical curiosity but also a vital subject of inquiry in the study of reasoning and meaning. The paradox of the arrow. The paradox of the arrow is one of several paradoxes proposed by the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea, who lived in the 5th century BCE. These paradoxes were designed to challenge and probe our understanding of motion, time, and change, concepts that seem intuitive yet are philosophically and logically complex when analyzed carefully. The arrow paradox, in particular, focuses on the nature of motion and whether it is truly possible at all. The paradox begins with a simple scenario: imagine an arrow in flight. To analyze its motion, we look at a single instant in time, just one specific moment. At that instant, Zeno argues, the arrow is occupying a space equal to its own length. It is not moving to the left or to the right, it is simply at rest in that particular location. Since time is made up of many such instants, Zeno reasons, we can break any period of motion into a series of these individual, motionless moments. But if the arrow is not moving at any single instant, then how can it be said to be moving at all? Zeno's conclusion is that motion is an illusion. If at every instant the arrow is motionless, and time is nothing more than a sequence of such instants, then it seems motion is impossible, because there is no moment at which the arrow is actually in motion. This paradox forces us to confront some difficult questions about the nature of time and motion. We commonly think of time as a continuous flow, and motion as something that occurs smoothly across that flow. But Zeno is challenging this assumption by dissecting motion into discrete, indivisible snapshots, each of which contains no motion in itself. To modern ears, the paradox might seem more puzzling than persuasive. After all, we see things move all the time. But Zeno's paradox raises important philosophical issues that have continued to influence thinkers for centuries. It anticipates problems in mathematics and physics about how to model continuity and change. If time is composed of indivisible points, and objects are at rest at every point, how does motion arise? And if time is instead a continuum, what does it mean to say something moves at an instant? The resolution to the paradox, from a modern perspective, comes from advances in calculus and the mathematical treatment of limits and instantaneous change. Using the tools developed in the 17th century by Newton and Leibniz, and later refined through the concept of the derivative, we can describe motion not by looking at what happens at a single point in time, but by analyzing how position changes with respect to time. Velocity is defined as the rate of change of position over time, not something that must be observed at a single static moment, but as a limit of position differences as time intervals shrink toward zero. In this framework, it is possible to say that the arrow has a well-defined velocity at every instant, even though it appears to be at rest at any single point. Motion, then, is not something that occurs within an instant, but something that is described across instants through the mathematics of change. Still, Zeno's arrow paradox continues to be a rich source of philosophical inquiry. It challenges us to examine the assumptions that underlie our most basic intuitions about the world, and to recognize that concepts like time and motion, though familiar, are deeply complex. Even if mathematics now provides tools to deal with such paradoxes, the philosophical implications of Zeno's reasoning remain a powerful reminder of how careful thought can reveal hidden difficulties in ideas we often take for granted. The Regress Problem. The regress problem is a fundamental philosophical paradox that arises when we try to justify any belief, statement, or piece of knowledge. At its core, the problem asks, if every belief must be justified by another belief, then what ultimately grounds any of our knowledge? This question reveals a potential infinite chain of reasoning that threatens to undermine the very possibility of knowing anything at all. To understand the problem, imagine you make a claim, for example, the Earth orbits the Sun. If asked to justify this belief, you might say, because astronomers have provided evidence for it. But then someone might ask, why do you believe the astronomers? You might respond, because science relies on systematic observation and experimentation. That leads to the next question, why trust systematic observation? And so on. For every justification you offer, another question about the justification of that justification can be asked. This leads to an infinite regress of reasons. There are three main ways this regress might unfold, and each leads to its own difficulties. Infinite regress: each belief is justified by another belief, and the chain continues infinitely with no starting point. This is problematic because we never arrive at a final, secure foundation for any belief. Human minds are finite, we cannot hold or process an infinite number of justifications, so this approach seems to make justification impossible in practice. Circular reasoning: at some point, the chain of justification loops back on itself. For instance, belief A is justified by belief B, which is justified by C, which is justified by A. But circular reasoning is generally regarded as fallacious, because it uses a belief to support itself, which fails to provide a genuine foundation. Foundationalism: this approach breaks the chain by asserting that some beliefs are foundational, they don't need justification from other beliefs. These are considered self-evident, indubitable, or justified in a non-inferential way, for example, through direct experience or rational intuition. Other beliefs are then built upon these foundational beliefs. However, the challenge for foundationalism is identifying which beliefs truly require no further justification and explaining why they are immune to the regress. There is also a fourth position, known as coherentism, which argues that beliefs are justified not in a linear chain but within a web or system. In this view, a belief is justified if it fits coherently within a larger, mutually supportive network of beliefs. This avoids infinite regress but raises new questions about whether coherence alone is enough to establish truth. The regress problem has deep implications for epistemology, the theory of knowledge. It forces us to examine how we justify our beliefs and whether knowledge is even possible without some kind of foundation or special justification method. Skeptics have used the regress problem to argue that knowledge may be unattainable, if every belief depends on another, and the chain either goes on forever or loops meaninglessly. How can we ever be sure of anything? On the other hand, responses like foundationalism and coherentism attempt to resolve the problem by offering different models of justification. Foundationalists trust in basic beliefs as a secure anchor, while coherentists look for stability in the interconnectedness of the whole belief system. Ultimately, the regress problem is not just an abstract puzzle. It challenges us to think carefully about the structure of our knowledge and the limits of reason. It asks whether there can be a firm ground beneath our beliefs or whether justification is always something we must accept as incomplete, uncertain, or provisional. In doing so, it highlights the difficulty of answering the most basic philosophical question of all: how do we know what we know? The paradox of the knower. The paradox of the knower is a philosophical and logical puzzle that explores the strange consequences that arise when we make statements about knowledge itself, particularly when we assert something about what will be known in the future. It is closely related to paradoxes involving self-reference and epistemic logic, and it illustrates the difficulties in consistently talking about knowledge using language that can refer to itself. The paradox typically begins with a sentence like this: "This sentence will not be known to be true." At first glance, the sentence seems simple enough. But when we analyze it carefully, we encounter a contradiction. Let's suppose that the sentence is true. That would mean that what it says is accurate: the sentence will not be known to be true. But if it is true, and we recognize that it is true, then it is known to be true, contradicting the sentence's claim that it will not be. On the other hand, suppose the sentence is false. That would mean that it will be known to be true. But then what it asserts, that it will not be known to be true, is incorrect, which again leads to contradiction because a sentence cannot be both false and accurately predict that it won't be known to be true. This creates a paradox: if the sentence is true, then it is not known to be true, but then it can't be true in the way we thought. If it is false, then it is known to be true, which contradicts its content. We are caught in a loop, much like in the liar paradox. This sentence is false, but here the problem is not about truth directly, it's about knowledge of truth. What makes the knower paradox especially interesting is that it appears when we try to formalize statements about knowledge within a logical system. Philosophers and logicians have long attempted to create rigorous systems for representing what is known and what can be said about knowledge, so-called epistemic logics. But when such systems allow for self-reference, where sentences can refer to their own knowledge status, they risk falling into paradoxes like this one. To see this in a more formal way, imagine a logical system that includes a knowledge operator, often symbolized as K, such that K, P, means, it is known that P. Now consider a sentence as such that S equals, S is not known to be true. In other words, S is identical to K, S. If S is true, then it must be true that S is not known to be true, but if that's the case, and we know this, then S becomes known, which contradicts its own content. If S is false, then it must be the case that S is known to be true, which again contradicts the claim it makes. So, either way, the system runs into contradiction. This paradox has significant implications for epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge, as well as for formal systems in logic and computer science. It shows that any system robust enough to express certain kinds of self-referential knowledge claims is vulnerable to internal contradiction unless carefully constrained. One way out of the paradox is to restrict the system so that it does not allow self-referential knowledge statements. Just as the liar paradox forced revisions to naive theories of truth, the knower paradox suggests that we may need to refine our understanding of what can be said, or known, within a logical or epistemic system. Another possible solution is to adopt a hierarchical approach, where statements about knowledge occur at different levels, preventing a statement from referring to its own knowledge status directly. This approach mirrors some of the solutions proposed to resolve semantic paradoxes involving truth. In any case, the paradox of the knower serves as a deep and subtle reminder of the complexities involved in thinking about knowledge, especially when we attempt to describe it from within a system that is itself capable of reflection and self-reference. It exposes a tension between our intuitive notions of knowledge and the logical constraints that govern how knowledge can be represented and discussed, pushing us to refine our models and expectations about what it really means to know something. The Censorship Paradox. The censorship paradox arises when attempts to suppress or control certain information unintentionally draw greater attention to it, thereby undermining the very goal of censorship. It reflects a contradiction between the intent to reduce public awareness of a message and the actual effect of the act of suppression, which often amplifies interest in the censored content. This paradox operates at the intersection of social behavior, freedom of expression, and the psychology of information control, and is closely related to what is popularly known as the Streisand effect. At its core, the paradox can be described in this way: when an authority, be it a government, institution, or private actor, attempts to prevent the spread of a particular piece of information by censoring it, the act of censorship itself becomes newsworthy or provocative. People, naturally curious and often suspicious of suppression, are drawn to discover what is being hidden. As a result, the information that was meant to be obscured becomes more widely known than it would have been had no action been taken. Consider a real-world example. In 2003, Barbra Streisand attempted to suppress photographs of her Malibu home that were part of a public database documenting coastal erosion in California. Before the lawsuit, the photo had been downloaded only a handful of times. After the legal action and media coverage of the attempt to remove the image, it was downloaded hundreds of thousands of times. The lawsuit, intended to protect her privacy, inadvertently brought massive public attention to the very image she wanted to conceal. This dynamic illustrates the paradox: the more effort is made to hide something, the more visible and interesting it becomes. Censorship, which is intended to minimize dissemination, can therefore act as a catalyst for increased exposure. The censorship paradox also highlights deeper philosophical tensions between authority and individual freedom. From a theoretical standpoint, censorship presumes that information can be controlled and that people will accept such control without resistance. But human psychology often resists this presumption. People tend to value autonomy and transparency, and the suppression of information may be perceived as a challenge to these values. The censored material then gains symbolic significance, not just for its content, but as a representation of forbidden knowledge or resistance to power. Moreover, in the age of digital communication and global connectivity, the paradox is more pronounced. Information, once censored in one domain, can quickly resurface in another, circulated by individuals who object to the act of suppression or are simply drawn to the mystique created by the attempt to silence it. The speed and breadth of the internet make controlling information far more difficult than in previous eras, and censorship efforts often backfire dramatically in this environment. Some responses to the paradox suggest that soft regulation or quiet moderation may be more effective than overt censorship, precisely because they avoid triggering the psychological and social mechanisms that lead to backlash and amplification. Others argue that the paradox reveals a fundamental flaw in authoritarian strategies of control, as it shows how suppression can undermine legitimacy and generate unintended consequences. The censorship paradox serves as a cautionary principle. Any attempt to silence or suppress information must consider not only whether it can succeed in technical terms, but also whether it will produce the opposite of its intended effect. It reminds us that information is not just a neutral set of data, but a powerful social force shaped by context, authority, and the human desire to know what others would hide. Goodman's Paradox. Goodman's Paradox, also known as the GRU Paradox, is a philosophical puzzle introduced by Nelson Goodman in his 1955 book Fact, Fiction, and Forecast. It challenges our understanding of inductive reasoning, which is the process by which we draw general conclusions based on limited observations, such as assuming the sun will rise tomorrow because it always has. Goodman's paradox reveals that this seemingly straightforward process of prediction is not as logically secure as we tend to assume. To set the stage, imagine we're trying to understand the world through observation. Suppose that up to now, every emerald we've examined has been green. Based on this consistent observation, we naturally form the inductive hypothesis: all emeralds are green. This seems reasonable and is the kind of inference we make all the time in everyday life and science. But Goodman asks us to consider a strange but carefully defined predicate: GRU. An object is defined as GRU if it has been observed before a certain time, say, January 1, 2050, and is green, or if it is observed after that time and is blue. In other words, something is GRU if it is green up to a certain point in time, but would be blue if observed after that time. This definition might sound artificial, but it's just as logically valid as the word green. Now consider this twist: all the emeralds we've seen so far are both green and GRU, because they were observed before the cutoff date and are green. So just as we could say, all emeralds are green, we could also say, with equal evidence, all emeralds are GRU. Both hypotheses are equally supported by past observations. But here's the problem: these two predictions make different claims about the future. If we believe all emeralds are green, we expect that future emeralds will be green. If we believe all emeralds are GRU, we must expect that emeralds after 2050 will be blue. So which prediction is justified by past evidence? Intuitively, we want to say green is the more natural, legitimate property, but why? Goodman's paradox challenges us to explain what makes some inductive inferences legitimate and others not, when both rely on exactly the same past observations. What makes green a better basis for future prediction than grew, especially when both apply equally to all observed emeralds? Goodman's point is that there is no purely formal or logical reason to prefer green over grew. The distinction must come from elsewhere, perhaps from the entrenched nature of some predicates. That is, green is a well-established, projectable predicate in our language and science, while grew is artificially constructed and unfamiliar. But this explanation is not rooted in pure logic, it relies on psychology, convention, and experience. Goodman uses the paradox to argue that induction is not a strictly logical process, and that our confidence in it rests on deeper, less explicit assumptions about language, relevance, and the way we structure concepts. Ultimately, Goodman's paradox does not refute induction but rather reveals that the rules we use to justify inductive reasoning are themselves in need of justification. It asks us to confront the uncomfortable reality that what counts as a reasonable projection into the future may depend not only on data and logic, but on the conceptual frameworks and linguistic habits we bring to the task. In this way, the paradox continues to influence debates in epistemology, the philosophy of science, and cognitive theory, highlighting the deep complexity behind what at first seems like simple reasoning from past to future. The Bootstrap Paradox. The Bootstrap Paradox is a fascinating and perplexing logical paradox rooted in the concept of time travel. It occurs when an object, piece of information, or person is sent back in time and becomes trapped within an infinite loop, having no clear point of origin. Essentially, it challenges the conventional understanding of causality, where causes precede effects, by creating a closed causal loop where the origin of something becomes impossible to determine. To illustrate the paradox, imagine a scenario involving a time traveler who reads a famous novel, such as Hamlet, in the present. The time traveler is so inspired by it that they decide to go back in time and meet William Shakespeare. However, upon arriving in the past, they discover that Shakespeare never wrote Hamlet. To preserve the literary timeline, the time traveler gives Shakespeare a copy of the play, and Shakespeare then publishes it under his name. Centuries later, the time traveler reads the very same Hamlet, but now the question arises, who actually wrote the play? The play exists because it was given to Shakespeare by someone who read it in the future. But if the time traveler only had access to the play because it already existed, and Shakespeare never originally created it, then the play seemingly has no point of origin. It was never truly written, it simply exists in a self-perpetuating loop. This paradox is named after the phrase, pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps, which refers to achieving something impossible without any external support, like lifting oneself into the air by tugging on one's own shoelaces. In the case of the Bootstrap Paradox, something comes into being without an origin, creating a logical inconsistency. The paradox becomes especially problematic when applied to information. If knowledge from the future is sent into the past and used to recreate itself in the future, then where did that knowledge come from? It undermines the foundation of causality and raises metaphysical questions about creation and authenticity. Some interpretations of time travel, such as those found in certain branches of theoretical physics or science fiction, attempt to resolve the paradox by proposing that the universe allows self-consistent time loops. According to these models, the events in the loop are fixed and cannot be altered, thereby avoiding contradictions but still leaving the mystery of origin intact. Ultimately, the Bootstrap Paradox illustrates one of the most mind-bending consequences of time travel, the possibility that something might exist simply because it exists, with no definitive beginning. It's a paradox that continues to intrigue philosophers, physicists, and storytellers alike, as it forces us to question the very nature of cause and effect, linear time, and reality itself. The Card Paradox. The card paradox is a self-referential logical puzzle that creates a contradiction by using language in a way that defies classical notions of truth and falsehood. Like the liar paradox, this statement is false. The card paradox challenges the foundations of logical reasoning by presenting a statement that cannot consistently be assigned a truth value. The paradox is often described as follows: imagine a card with writing on both sides. On side A, it reads, "The sentence on the other side of this card is true." Then you flip the card over to side B, which says, "The sentence on the other side of this card is false." At first glance, this seems like a simple exchange of statements. But as soon as you try to evaluate their truth, you enter a loop that leads to a contradiction. Let's say the sentence on side A is true. That means that what it says is correct, so the sentence on side B is indeed true. But side B says that the sentence on side A is false. So if side B is true, then side A must be false. That contradicts our original assumption that side A is true. On the other hand, let's assume that the sentence on side A is false. Then what it says is not true, so the sentence on side B is not true. But side B claims that side A is false, and if that's not true, then side A must be true. Again, contradiction. In either case, whether you assume the sentence on side A is true or false, you are forced into a loop where each side's truth depends on the other in a way that leads to inconsistency. The statements are structured in a mutually dependent and self-referential fashion, which prevents either from having a stable truth value. This makes the card paradox a version of a semantic paradox, a statement, or pair of statements, that fails to be either true or false due to the way language and reference are being used. Philosophically and logically, this paradox highlights the difficulties that arise when systems allow self-reference, that is, when sentences refer to their own truth conditions directly or indirectly. These kinds of puzzles have had major implications for logic, especially in the 20th century with developments like Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which showed that any sufficiently powerful formal system will contain statements that are true but unprovable within the system, or statements whose truth cannot be determined at all. In short, the card paradox reveals that natural language, when allowed to bend back on itself, can give rise to logical structures that defy classical binary logic. It reminds us that truth is not always a simple matter of yes or no. Sometimes, the very structure of our reasoning traps us in contradiction. The paradox of the court. The paradox of the court, also known as the Regress Paradox, is an ancient logical dilemma that illustrates the complexities of legal reasoning and self-referential conditions in contractual agreements. It involves a famous sophist, Protagoras, and one of his students, Euathlus, and is often cited as a philosophical and legal puzzle with no clear resolution due to the circularity of its arguments. According to the story, Protagoras agreed to teach Euathlus the art of law and rhetoric on the condition that Euathlus would pay Protagoras for the lessons only after he won his first case in court. The agreement was intended as a practical and fair deal. Euathlus would only owe payment once his training proved successful in the real world. However, after completing his education, Euathlus did not take on any cases. He postponed entering the legal profession and thus, under the agreement, did not owe Protagoras any payment. Frustrated by this delay and feeling he was being cheated, Protagoras eventually sued Euathlus for the payment. What followed is the paradox itself, stemming from the conflicting legal arguments each party presented. Protagoras' argument was straightforward and seemingly airtight: if he won the case, then the court would compel Euathlus to pay him, and he would receive his money. But if Euathlus won the case, then he would have, by definition, won his first legal case, thus fulfilling the condition of the original contract, and would then have to pay Protagoras according to their agreement. In either outcome, whether the court ruled in favor of Protagoras or Euathlus, Protagoras argued he should be paid. Euathlus, however, had a similarly compelling counterargument. If the court ruled in his favor, then he would not have to pay Protagoras, since the court explicitly said so. If the court ruled against him, then he still would not have to pay Protagoras, because he still would not have won a case, this case being a loss, so the condition of the agreement would not be fulfilled. In both scenarios, Euathlus contended that he was not obligated to pay. This creates a paradox. Both parties have constructed valid-seeming arguments that appear to guarantee victory regardless of the outcome. The court finds itself in a logical bind. If it rules in favor of Protagoras, it indirectly fulfills the condition of the original agreement, which would mean Euathlus must pay. But if it rules in favor of Euathlus, then according to Protagoras' logic, Euathlus has won his first case and should pay anyway. On the other hand, ruling in favor of Protagoras may imply that Euathlus must pay before having won a case, violating the original contract. Yet ruling in favor of Euathlus also results in a contradiction, since it means he should not pay, despite having now met the condition that should trigger payment. The paradox of the court is not only a rhetorical and legal curiosity but also a lesson in the limits of contractual logic when it involves self-reference and conditional obligations. It bears resemblance to other logical paradoxes, such as the liar paradox or Russell's paradox, in that it deals with circular reasoning and contradictions that emerge when definitions or rules refer to themselves. This paradox highlights the importance of clear legal definitions and the dangers of conditional contracts that depend on future events with unclear boundaries. It also underscores how different interpretations of the same event or agreement can lead to fundamentally incompatible conclusions. To this day, the Protagoras paradox remains a powerful example of how law and logic intersect, and sometimes collide, in ways that challenge our understanding of fairness, obligation, and truth. The Replication Paradox. The Replication Paradox emerges when we explore the idea of perfectly copying a conscious being, down to every atom, memory, and neural connection, and then ask what happens to identity, continuity, and self. Imagine a technology that can scan a human being in precise detail and recreate an identical copy, either instantly or at a different location. The copy would think, feel, and believe it is the original. It would remember your childhood, your favorite meals, your relationships. From its perspective, it is you. But now the paradox begins: if the copy is truly identical, then who is the real you? At first glance, one might say the original is still the real person, and the copy is just that, a copy. But suppose the original is destroyed at the exact moment the replica is created. To an external observer, nothing is lost, the copy behaves and functions exactly as the original would. Yet to the original consciousness, the question is more troubling. Did you survive? Or was your stream of experience irreversibly ended, replaced by a new but indistinguishable consciousness? The paradox intensifies when we consider multiple copies. If one perfect replica is possible, then why not 2 or 10? Each would believe itself to be the original and behave accordingly. But they cannot all be the continuation of the same conscious self, since they will diverge and form different experiences almost instantly. This raises the uncomfortable question: if identity can be replicated and split, does it mean that personal identity is an illusion? Or does continuity of consciousness depend on some uncopyable essence? The paradox challenges our intuitions about identity. In the physical world, replication seems straightforward. We can clone information, structures, even biological cells. But consciousness seems to resist this logic. Our sense of self is tied not just to structure and memory, but to a singular, uninterrupted point of view, something that seems indivisible and non-transferable. Yet there is no obvious physical basis for why continuity should matter more than duplication. From the outside, a perfect replica is functionally indistinguishable. From the inside, the line between life and death may hinge on a single unbroken stream of awareness. Philosophers have debated variations of this puzzle for decades, especially in discussions of teleportation, artificial intelligence, and thought experiments like the teletransportation paradox. The replication paradox forces us to question what it means to be you. Is personal identity just information and pattern? Is it the uninterrupted flow of consciousness? Or is it something deeper, perhaps metaphysical, that science cannot touch? In the end, the paradox does not offer a clear resolution. It reveals the tension between our physical understanding of replication and our inner experience of being a unique, continuous self. It unsettles the boundary between life and simulation, between death and duplication, and leaves us with a haunting philosophical riddle: if everything that makes you, you, can be copied, what, if anything, makes you original? Epimenides Paradox. The Epimenides Paradox is a classic example of a logical contradiction that arises from self-reference. It originates from a statement attributed to Epimenides of Knossos, a 6th century BCE philosopher and poet from Crete, who famously declared, "All Cretans are liars." At first glance, this seems like a simple generalization or a sweeping criticism of his fellow countrymen. However, upon closer inspection, the logical implications of this statement lead to a paradox. The central issue is that Epimenides himself was a Cretan. If his claim that all Cretans are liars is true, then he, being a Cretan, must also be a liar. But if he is lying, then his statement, "all Cretans are liars," must be false. That would imply that not all Cretans are liars, at least one must be telling the truth. But if that's the case, then perhaps Epimenides himself is telling the truth, in which case all Cretans are indeed liars, including himself, which again makes the statement false. The cycle continues indefinitely, and we are caught in a logical loop that defies consistent interpretation. This paradox is a special case of what is known more broadly as the liar paradox, where a statement refers to itself in a way that creates a contradiction. The classic example is the sentence, "This sentence is false." If the sentence is true, then it must be false as it claims, but if it is false, then it must be true. The liar paradox and its variations challenge our understanding of truth, especially in systems that require a clear binary of true or false. They expose limitations in classical logic, which traditionally holds that every proposition must be either true or false and cannot be both. In the case of the Epimenides paradox, some interpretations have tried to resolve the contradiction by questioning whether Epimenides was speaking literally and universally, or whether his statement was hyperbolic or rhetorical. Others suggest he might have meant that Cretans are frequently untruthful rather than universally so. However, when his statement is taken as an absolute and literal logical proposition, the contradiction becomes unavoidable. The implications of this paradox reach far beyond ancient rhetoric. In modern logic, mathematics, and computer science, similar self-referential problems appear in various forms, often with significant consequences. Notably, in the early 20th century, logical paradoxes influenced foundational work in formal systems and provability. Bertrand Russell encountered a similar problem in set theory, known as Russell's paradox, while Kurt Gödel used a form of self-reference in his incompleteness theorems to show that any sufficiently powerful formal system cannot be both complete and consistent. Despite its ancient origins, the Epimenides paradox continues to be a powerful illustration of how language and logic can turn back on themselves, creating puzzles that are still relevant in philosophical inquiry and theoretical research. It reminds us that not all statements are easily categorized as true or false, and that self-reference, while often useful, must be approached with caution in logical systems. Grelling-Nelson Paradox. The Grelling-Nelson paradox is a subtle and fascinating logical paradox that arises from the way adjectives can be used to describe themselves, or not. It concerns autological and heterological adjectives and highlights the complications that emerge when language begins to refer to itself. Formulated by the German philosophers Kurt Grelling and Leonard Nelson in the early 20th century, this paradox challenges our understanding of self-reference and classification in language. To understand the paradox, we begin by defining two kinds of adjectives. An autological adjective is one that describes itself. For example, the word short is a short word, so short is autological. The word English is an English word, so it, too, is autological. The adjective polysyllabic, having many syllables, is itself polysyllabic. A heterological adjective, on the other hand, is one that does not describe itself. For instance, long is not a long word, so it is heterological. French is not a French word, so it is also heterological. At first, this seems like a clever but straightforward linguistic game. However, the paradox arises when we ask the seemingly innocent question, is the word heterological heterological? Let's analyze both possibilities. Suppose heterological is heterological. That means it does not describe itself. But if it doesn't describe itself, and it is heterological, then it must describe itself. This is a contradiction. Suppose heterological is not heterological, which would mean it does describe itself. But that would make it autological. However, if it's autological, then it must describe itself, which would mean it is not heterological, but that's what we were assuming. Again, we are led into contradiction. In both cases, we reach a logical inconsistency. The adjective heterological cannot be consistently classified as either heterological or autological. This leads to a paradox, a breakdown in our ability to apply what seems like a sensible classification scheme. The deeper cause of the paradox lies in self-reference, the same issue that underlies the liar paradox, this sentence is false, and Russell's paradox in set theory, the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. In each case, we're dealing with a situation where a concept attempts to apply to itself, and the rules of language or logic no longer yield a consistent result. The Grelling-Nelson paradox is particularly interesting because it does not rely on obscure or complex mathematical ideas. It emerges from ordinary language and a seemingly simple question about how words relate to themselves. Yet, despite its apparent simplicity, it exposes a deep tension in how language and classification systems operate when self-reference is involved. Philosophers and logicians have taken this paradox seriously, especially when exploring the foundations of language, truth, and logic. It serves as a reminder that even the most basic linguistic structures can harbor contradictions when self-reference is introduced. Attempts to resolve the paradox often involve developing more rigorous systems of logic or adopting formal languages that restrict or eliminate self-reference altogether. In the end, the Grelling-Nelson paradox stands as a compelling example of how natural language can lead us into logical difficulties, and it continues to be a rich subject of study for anyone interested in the philosophy of language, logic, and semantics. Skolem's paradox. Skolem's paradox is a striking and somewhat unsettling puzzle in the foundations of mathematics. It arises from the apparent conflict between the ideas of countability and uncountability, central concepts in set theory, and is named after the Norwegian mathematician Thorolf Skolem. At its core, the paradox shows how a mathematical theory that proves the existence of uncountable sets can, paradoxically, be modeled within a countable framework. This creates a deep tension between the internal view of a mathematical universe and the external, or meta-theoretical, perspective. The background of the paradox lies in formal logic and model theory. Set theory, particularly the Zermelo-Fraenkel axioms, ZF, is a foundational system used to describe all of mathematics. Within ZF, one can rigorously define and prove the existence of uncountable sets, most famously, the set of real numbers, which is proven to be uncountable by Cantor's diagonal argument. That is, there is no way to list all real numbers in a sequence indexed by the natural numbers. Now comes the twist. According to the Leuvenheim-Skolem theorem in logic, if a first-order theory like ZF has any model at all, that is, if it's logically consistent, then it must also have a model that is countable. This means that all the elements of this model can, in principle, be listed in a sequence like the natural numbers. So ZF has a model that contains sets which, according to the model, are uncountable, even though, from the outside, the model itself is countable. This leads to the paradox: how can a countable model contain uncountable sets? It seems absurd, like a small box claiming to contain a larger box within it. But the resolution lies in the distinction between internal and external perspectives. From outside the model, the metatheoretical viewpoint, we can see that the model is countable, because we can assign a number to each of its elements. But within the model itself, there is no function that can establish a one-to-one correspondence between what it considers to be uncountable sets, like the reals, and the natural numbers. That is, the model does not see its own countability. The paradox therefore isn't a true contradiction, but a profound and disorienting realization about how models of mathematics behave. It reveals that certain properties, like uncountability, are relative, they depend on the viewpoint of the observer. From inside a model, the axioms of set theory are faithfully followed, and uncountable sets behave as they should. But from outside, we might see that the entire model is countable, and the uncountable sets within it are actually part of a listable structure. Skolem's paradox challenges our assumptions about mathematical truth and universality. It shows that even the most fundamental ideas, like the size of infinite sets, can shift depending on the lens through which we examine them. It undermines the naive idea that set theory provides a single, absolute foundation for all of mathematics, and suggests instead that mathematics is layered with multiple levels of reality, each with its own internal logic and limitations. The Paradox of Foreknowledge. The paradox of foreknowledge is a deep and challenging philosophical puzzle that arises when we attempt to reconcile the idea of divine or infallible foreknowledge with the concept of human free will. It has been a central issue in theology and philosophy for centuries, particularly within the context of classical theism, where God is believed to be omniscient, that is, all-knowing, including complete knowledge of all past, present, and future events. The paradox typically begins with the assumption that God, or any infallible being, has perfect foreknowledge of all future events. Suppose, for instance, that God knows today that you will choose to drink tea tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. This knowledge is not just a guess or a strong prediction, it is infallible and certain. Now, when 8 a.m. arrives, can you choose to drink coffee instead? On the surface, it seems that you cannot, because if you did, then God's prior knowledge would have been incorrect. But if it is impossible for you to do otherwise, then your choice does not appear to be free. This leads to the central tension: if an action is foreknown infallibly, then it must occur, but if it must occur, how can it be free? In other words, if the future is already known and settled, then it seems to be determined, and if it is determined, then it seems you cannot genuinely choose it freely. This creates a conflict between two widely held beliefs, that humans have free will and that an omniscient being knows all future events. The paradox becomes even clearer when applied to moral responsibility. If your actions are already known and thus unavoidable, can you truly be held accountable for them? If God knows in advance that a person will commit a crime, and that knowledge cannot be wrong, then it appears the person is bound to commit the crime. Yet moral responsibility presupposes the ability to choose otherwise. Various responses to the paradox have been proposed over the centuries. Theological determinism. Some accept that if God knows the future infallibly, then the future is determined, and human freedom is an illusion. This view preserves divine foreknowledge but sacrifices libertarian free will. Open theism. Others reject the idea that the future is entirely knowable, suggesting that God knows all that can be known, but the future consists partly of free choices that are not yet determined and therefore not knowable in advance. This preserves free will but redefines omniscience as knowing everything that is logically possible to know. Compatibilism. A popular response among philosophers is to argue that foreknowledge does not cause future actions, it simply reflects them. Just because God knows what you will do does not mean He causes you to do it. In this view, God's knowledge is like a perfect record of future facts, not a force that compels them. You still act freely, it just so happens that your actions are known in advance. Timeless knowledge. Another traditional theological solution is to say that God exists outside of time and sees all of history, past, present, and future, as a single eternal moment. From this vantage point, God doesn't foresee events in a temporal sense, rather, He observes them eternally. Because He does not predict but simply perceives all of time at once, there is no conflict with free will. However, this view introduces its own conceptual challenges, especially in explaining how a timeless being can interact with a temporal world. Despite these attempts at resolution, the paradox of foreknowledge remains a compelling and unsettled problem. It forces us to grapple with fundamental questions about the nature of time, causality, freedom, and the limits of divine knowledge. Whether one leans toward preserving the idea of a fully omniscient being, defending human free will, or redefining one or both concepts, the paradox serves as a powerful lens through which to examine the deeper structures of metaphysical and theological thought. It reminds us that beliefs which may seem straightforward in isolation can come into profound conflict when held together, and resolving those conflicts often demands a rethinking of our most basic assumptions. The paradox of self-amendment. The paradox of self-amendment arises when a legal or formal system includes a rule that allows it to amend or change its own rules, including the very rule that allows for amendment. At first, this sounds reasonable. After all, constitutions, bylaws, and governing procedures often include mechanisms for their own revision. But once we consider the implications of a system being able to modify the rule that governs its own modification, a deep and troubling loop begins to emerge. Suppose a constitution has a rule, let's call it Rule A, that says amendments can be made by a 2/3 majority vote. Then the government amends Rule A itself, declaring that, from now on, only a simple majority is required. If this new version of Rule A was passed using the old 2/3 rule, it might seem legitimate. But what if it was passed using the new rule, a simple majority, before that rule was actually in effect? Did it then retroactively legalize its own existence? This is the heart of the paradox. Can a system validly use its own amendment rule to alter or even abolish that very rule? If so, then authority appears to be self-justifying, and any limits on power can be swept away by invoking those same powers. If not, then the amendment process becomes frozen in place, unable to adapt or change its own structure when necessary. The paradox echoes deeper philosophical tensions between legal positivism and natural law. Legal positivists might argue that as long as the process is followed, the rule is valid, even if it changes the process itself. But others point out that allowing a rule to rewrite the rules of rewriting leads to an unstable foundation. It's as if a ladder could pull itself up by its own rungs, or a book could revise the rules for editing itself mid-sentence. Real-world examples highlight the difficulty. Consider Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, which outlines the amendment process. If the US wanted to amend Article 5 itself, say, to make future amendments easier, could it do so under the current process? Or would it be stuck in a logical bind, unable to alter the very rule that defines how it can be altered? Legal theorist Peter Suber, who formulated this paradox most clearly, distinguishes between amendment power and amendment rules. The former is the practical authority to change the system, the latter are the rules that structure how that change must happen. When those two layers collide, when the authority modifies the conditions of its own authority, the paradox of self-amendment is born. This paradox challenges our assumptions about hierarchy, consistency, and self-reference in rule-based systems. It shows that even in carefully constructed legal frameworks, logic can bend back on itself, leading to uncertainty about legitimacy and authority. It's not just a curiosity of law, it echoes broader questions about how systems define and limit themselves, and whether any rule can ever truly be beyond revision when the power to revise is itself unlimited. The problem of induction. The problem of induction arises from a simple question: how can we justify our belief that the future will resemble the past? Every day, humans make predictions based on patterns and past experiences. We expect the sun to rise tomorrow because it has risen every day before. We assume bread will nourish rather than poison us because it always has. Scientists, too, rely on this method, observing repeated events and forming general laws. This process, known as induction, takes specific instances and draws broader conclusions from them. Yet, the philosophical foundation of this practice is more fragile than it seems. David Hume famously exposed this fragility in the 18th century. He argued that there is no rational basis for believing that the future must mirror the past. Just because something has happened repeatedly does not logically guarantee it will continue to happen. The sun rising every day for thousands of years does not logically entail it will rise tomorrow. It's only a habit of thought, a psychological expectation, not a logical certainty. The problem deepens when one attempts to justify induction itself. Suppose we argue that induction has worked well in the past, so it will likely work in the future. This is an inductive argument, it assumes what it's trying to prove. It's circular. We're using induction to justify induction. But what if we try a deductive justification? There is no deductive rule that says a pattern in the past must continue, the conclusion doesn't follow with necessity. Therefore, induction seems to lack both inductive and deductive support. This presents a paradox: almost all of our knowledge about the world depends on induction. Science, medicine, daily life, all rest on assumptions about regularity in nature. Yet we have no firm logical ground for trusting those assumptions. We are left in a position where something appears both indispensable and unjustifiable. Some philosophers, like Karl Popper, tried to sidestep the problem by suggesting that science should rely on falsification rather than induction. We cannot confirm a universal law, but we can disprove it with a single counterexample. Still, this approach does not eliminate our reliance on inductive reasoning, it only reframes it. The problem of induction challenges the very basis of empirical knowledge. It does not mean we must stop trusting our experiences or abandon science, but it reminds us that our confidence in the uniformity of nature is a kind of leap, a deeply ingrained, pragmatic belief rather than a logical certainty. This paradox quietly shadows every prediction we make, highlighting a gap between what we know and what we can prove. The problem of the criterion. The problem of the criterion is a foundational puzzle in epistemology that challenges how we can ever know anything at all. It begins with two basic questions: what do we know, and how do we know it? These seem like reasonable inquiries, but they turn out to be deeply entangled. To answer what we know, we need a method or criterion to determine whether a belief counts as knowledge. But to establish a valid method, we must already know something that allows us to test whether the method works. The paradox lies in this circularity. To know what we know, we need a criterion. To establish a criterion, we need to know what we know. This problem was clearly articulated by the philosopher Sextus Empiricus and later refined by Roderick Chisholm in modern epistemology. Chisholm presents three possible responses to the problem. One is methodism, which says we should start by identifying a reliable method for acquiring knowledge and then use that method to determine what we know. But this leads to skepticism because, without prior knowledge, how can we judge the reliability of any method? The second approach is particularism, which suggests we begin with examples of things we know and from there try to derive a general method. Yet this assumes that we can already be sure of certain knowledge without having a method, raising the question of how we knew it in the first place. The third path is skepticism, which accepts that we cannot escape the circle and concludes that we may not be able to know anything at all. The paradox emerges because every attempt to break the circle seems to smuggle in assumptions that depend on what it's trying to prove. If you pick the method first, you have no ground for trusting it without examples. If you start with examples, you implicitly rely on an undefined method of selection. This creates a kind of intellectual standstill, where the foundational basis of knowledge becomes suspect. In everyday life, we rarely worry about this dilemma. We form beliefs based on perception, memory, testimony, and logic, and we usually take them for granted. But the problem of the criterion forces us to confront the deeper question of why we trust these sources. It exposes a hidden vulnerability in human reasoning, our inability to justify our knowledge without relying on that very knowledge. This paradox does not have a universally accepted solution, and that's precisely what gives it philosophical weight. It doesn't prove that knowledge is impossible, but it does challenge the possibility of a non-circular foundation for it. Like many philosophical paradoxes, it serves less to destroy our confidence and more to illuminate its limits, forcing us to recognize the assumptions that underlie our understanding of the world. Yablo's Paradox. Yablo's paradox is a logical puzzle that challenges our understanding of self-reference and contradiction, but with a twist. It creates a paradox without any sentence directly referring to itself. This sets it apart from classical paradoxes like the liar paradox, which relies on a statement saying, "This sentence is false." Stephen Yablo introduced his paradox in the 1990s to demonstrate that self-reference is not a necessary condition for paradox. The cleverness of the construction lies in using an infinite sequence of statements, each referring only to the truth or falsity of later statements in the sequence, and yet arriving at a contradiction all the same. Imagine an infinite list of sentences, S, S2, S3, and so on, where each sentence S says, "For all K, N, S is not true." In other words, each sentence is saying that every sentence that comes after it is false. Notably, no sentence refers to itself, each only refers to the ones that follow it in the list. This setup avoids direct self-reference, which makes the paradox especially elegant and deceptive. Now consider the implications. Suppose one of the sentences in this list is true. Let's say S is true. That means that all the sentences after S must be false, S, S2, and so on. But if S is false, then what it asserts is not the case. Recall that S claims that all sentences after it are false. If S is false, then at least one sentence after it must be true. That would be one of S2, S3, etc. But we just said that all those were false, because S is true. This contradiction suggests that our assumption that S is true must be incorrect. So what if all the sentences are false? Suppose every S in the list is false. Then look at S. It says that all sentences after it are false. But we're assuming that they are all false. So S would actually be true, which contradicts our assumption that all the sentences are false. The same contradiction arises no matter which sentence you analyze. If any one of them is true, it implies that the others are false, which loops back and makes at least one of them true again. If all of them are false, then at least one must be true. This infinite regress of reference creates a paradox not by looping back on itself, but by constantly shifting the burden of falsity forward, endlessly deferring the contradiction until it implodes. The genius of Yablo's construction is that it appears to escape the classical trap of self-reference, yet it lands us in the same logical quagmire. It suggests that the essence of paradox might not lie in direct circularity but in certain patterns of dependency and negation. Yablo's paradox therefore pushes us to reconsider how paradoxes arise and whether the root cause is self-reference itself or something more subtle in the structure of language and logic.